later in the same chapter, the author picks up with a quote that we used from a quote that we used last week's lesson, and we're going to kind of do this. This is very powerful. Starts in page 763. The warfare against God's law, which was begun in heaven. What was the warfare against, according to this focus? The law of God. The warfare against God's law, which began in heaven, will continue until the end of time. What law? Did the warfare in heaven, Adventists need to think this through really carefully. When Satan began his warfare in heaven, was an attack on the Sabbath? No. Did the Sabbath even yet exist? No. It did not. And if we focus at the end of time, that the warfare at the end of time is a question simply and only of the Sabbath, we're missing the entire focus of the war. We're being tricked. The Jews that put Christ on the cross wanted him off by sunset. Why? To keep the Sabbath. They weren't confused about the day of the week. They were completely seduced to believing the lie about the law, though. And if we don't understand the truth about the law, then we'll be like the Jews who will reject Christ while we keep the Sabbath. So, the warfare against God's law began in heaven will be continued to the end of time. How could Satan war in heaven against God's law? Think that through. Do you think Satan went into a legislative body and lobbied behind the scenes and deleted 33,000 emails and other things? You think this is what he was doing? I mean, in other words, there was no legislative bodies that he was trying to introduce bills to, was he? Can Satan, then or now, actually change God's law? Can you? So how would he war against God's law? If he can't change it, how can he war against it?
Change our view of it.
Change our view of it. Get us to conceive of it in a way that's not true. To get angels to believe God's laws are simply imposed rules, and suddenly God's a rule giver and an enforcer that can hurt us if we don't do his rules, rather than seeing them as design protocols. Keep me on with the quote. Every man will be tested. Obedience or disobedience is the question to be decided by the whole world. Pause right there. What law lens do you hear that sentence through? How many of you grew up in Adventism or some other branch of Christianity with the idea that God's law was like human law, is a system of rules that you got to keep? And then when you read this, well, the question is obedience or disobedience. Oh, man, that's perfectionism. Oh, man, I've got to obey. Oh, that's stressful. Oh, I can't do it. Oh, how terrifying. How many grew up that way? Yes, this is exactly because you're reading that through the lie that God's law works like human law. When you understand design law and you understand his laws are like the law of respiration. Law of respiration, if you want to live, you've got to breathe. It's a law. And you can transgress it, tie a plastic bag over your head, hoard your carbon dioxide to yourself. You can transgress the law, but the wages of that are... And so when you say obedience or disobedience is the question, it's how many are willing to allow God to restore them to harmony with life? That's it. And when he finishes his work in us, it will be easy. It will be as easy to love others and live in harmony with his law as it is to breathe. Now I see some physicians in the room, healthcare providers. For the healthy people, breathing is not difficult. But have any of you ever had somebody who was really diseased so bad in their lungs, in their pulmonary functions, that they actually couldn't even breathe on their own? They had to have artificial respiration, or they were going to die. Okay? That's our state after Adam. Our natural capacity for love and for living in harmony is broken. But God is working for those who trust him to restore in us those capacities. I'll write my law on your registry in heaven. No, on your heart and mind. On your heart and mind, I'll make you new. You'll be reborn. Keep going with the quote. Obedience or disobedience will be the question to be decided by the whole world. All will be called to choose between the law of God and the laws of men. as I'm making this idea between design law and imposed law, do you see how clear this is? But when you read statements like this, when you already believe God's law works like our law, then you read into it things like this. All men will be called to choose between what day they go to church on. That's not what it says. The law of God versus the laws of men. God's laws are design laws. Man's laws are imposed rules. Completely different. And the way they're enforced is different. Here, the dividing line will be drawn. There will be but two classes. Notice the next quote, next sentence. Two classes. Every character will be fully developed. How is character developed? Okay, now this is important because I've been getting some emails lately from people who don't like what we put in our Heavenly Sanctuary Investigative Judgment Manual about character, people being perfected in the investigative judgment for those who trusted God. They don't like it because they have the view that character is only developed by your work. Now it's true, your character can't be developed without your participation and your choosing. But your choosing cannot develop your character alone. And what is it we're primarily choosing? We're choosing to engage with God and to yoke up with Him in a trust bond of love. That's what we're choosing. And then by beholding Him, we're changed. And then it is no longer I that live, but Christ lives in me. And He wills and does in us according to His good pleasure. And a supernatural power works in us to give us new ideas, new conceptions, new desires, new motives. And this reforming of our hearts for those who choose day by day to participate and walk with God and love what He loves is part of that process. But it requires the two to work together. God can't save a person against their will, and a person cannot choose to save themselves against their will. So, as we choose the laws of God, we're won back to trust, and we participate in His kingdom, and we go stronger in godliness. But there's always the indwelling Spirit that is a part of that process. You're never really choosing anything of God on your own. The desire, the enlightenment, the wisdom, the discernment, all those things are the Holy Spirit's working. That you're left free, but when you choose it, you're choosing to link up with God.
That's why He used the grafting of the vine into the branches, because He's the one that gives us the source of everything. Our job is to link up.
That's right. That's right. Every character will be fully developed, and all will show whether they have chosen the side of loyalty or that of rebellion. That's our choice. We do get that choice. But we don't have the power to fix ourselves. That power is from the Lord working in us as we choose to stay in line with loyalty. Continuing on. Then the end will come. God will vindicate His law and deliver His people. Pause. How does He vindicate His law? And this is very important, because this infection in Christianity teaches these doctrines in all branches of Christianity that I've seen, that God's vindication of His law is actually sustaining Satan's lie and undermining His law. When you think about vindicating His law, what law lens are you looking through? If you think vindicating law means He uses His power to finally put down those rebellious people, to inflict the right punishment and ultimately kill them, then you've just supported the lie that God's law is as Satan says. He hadn't vindicated. He just supported Satan, validated Satan, because that's not how His law works. It was sustained Satan's charges. And this is what the Christian community is teaching. And they're preparing the world to meet Satan impersonating Christ, who will come and do that very thing. Satan and all who have joined him in rebellion will be cut off. Notice, what happens to them? Cut off. What happens to a branch that's cut off from the vine? Does the vine have to use power to kill the branch? No. And what causes the branches to be cut off? Who's taking the action to cut off the branches? We are not to regard God as waiting to punish the sinner for a sin. The sinner brings the punishment upon himself. Every act of sin reacts upon the sinner, makes it more easy for him to transgress again. Pardon? Yes. He says, I make the choice. And persisting in sin separates one from God, cuts themselves off from the channel of blessing, cuts themselves off from the channel, and the sure result is ruin and death. That's First Selected Messages, page 238, I believe. Yeah. So the cutting off. We cut ourselves off. Who cuts you? If you tie a plastic bag over your head and you transgress the law of respiration, who cuts you off from oxygen? You cut yourself off. And so Satan and all who've joined him in rebellion will be cut off. Sin and sinners will perish, root and branch. This is not an act of arbitrary power on the part of God. What is arbitrary power? Well, I don't know, maybe say giving somebody 40 months in jail for lying in an investigation. 40 months is an arbitrary use of power. Arguing that it should be 9 years instead of 40 months. That's an arbitrary use of power. Okay? Dying from cutting yourself off from oxygen, no, that's not arbitrary. That's the unavoidable consequence of being out of harmony with how reality works. Any infliction of a punishment that is not inherently built in is an arbitrary use of power. Saw a hand somewhere. Yes?
That's the statement in States to Christ. It says, it is by no arbitrary decree from God that the wicked are excluded from heaven.
That's right.
Excluded from heaven by their own unfitness for it. Same thing.
That's exactly right. Well said. Thank you. Here, and continuing on with the quote, the rejectors of his mercy reap that which they have sown. Now that's one of the design laws, sowing and reaping. You reap what you sow. Design law. God, the fountain of life, God is the fountain of life, and when one chooses the service of sin, he separates from God and thus cuts himself off from life. I didn't even have to go to that other quote. It's right here. He is alienated from the life of God. Christ says, all that hate me love death. Do you see design law in this? God gives them existence for a time that they may develop their character and reveal their principles. This accomplished, they receive the results of their own choice. By a life of rebellion, Satan and all who unite with him place themselves so out of harmony with God that his very presence to them is a consuming fire. The glory of him who is love will destroy them. Why do they die? Why? An infliction from God. He doesn't want them to be with him. He's angry. He's wrathful. Jesus stopped his intercession in heaven, and God couldn't restrain himself anymore. Those anger management classes just didn't work. Yes?
He's grieving at the time. He's not punishing them. They're punishing themselves. It's breaking his heart that they don't want to come in.
Yes. It's the same attitude a parent has for that child dying of liver failure who would not get in recovery. Same attitude. At the beginning of the great controversy, the angels in heaven did not understand this. We're asking the question, why? The question we're focusing on is, why can God not eradicate sin by using might and power? That's what we're trying to reveal here. At the beginning of the great controversy, the angels did not understand this. What did they not understand? The nature of sin, the fullness of God's law, and why sin results in death. They didn't understand it. Had Satan and his hosts then been left to reap the full result of their sin, they would have perished. But it would not have been apparent to heavenly beings that this was the inevitable result of sin. A doubt of God's goodness would have remained in their minds, an evil seed to produce its deadly fruit of sin and woe. Do you see? God cannot eradicate sin by using power to kill sinners. He can't do it. Because it actually sustained first Satan's lie that God is the source of inflicted pain and suffering. And if he would just leave us alone, we can live eternally in sin, because sin doesn't hurt you, only God hurts you for it. And so the doubt of God's goodness remains. And he couldn't even let Satan and his angels reap the natural results of full separation from him back then, because the rest of the angels wouldn't have understood, and they would have doubted, and they thought God did it to them. And the Christian church is still teaching this lie, that God is the source of pain and death. Monday's lesson